Jacob Thornton wiped the sweat from his forehead as he loaded his worn leather saddlebags onto his horse. The morning sun was just peeking over the tall pine trees that surrounded his small cabin. It was that time of month again. Time to make the long journey down the mountain to Cedar Falls for supplies. Living alone on the mountain for the past 8 years had taught Jacob many things. He knew how to hunt deer and catch fish from the crystal-clear streams. He could fix anything that broke in his cabin with just a few basic tools. He had learned to read the weather by watching the clouds and could predict a storm days before it arrived. But there was one thing Jacob had never learned: how to stop feeling so terribly alone. At 35 years old, Jacob was a strong man with broad shoulders and calloused hands from years of hard work. His beard was thick and dark, and his eyes were the color of winter sky. Most people in town thought he was tough as nails, but deep inside, Jacob felt an emptiness that seemed to grow bigger every day. The ride down to Cedar Falls took 3 hours on the winding mountain trails. Jacob's horse, Thunder, knew the path well and stepped carefully around the rocks and fallen logs. As they descended, the air grew warmer and the sounds of civilization slowly replaced the peaceful quiet of the mountains. Cedar Falls wasn't much of a town, just a main street with a few wooden buildings, a general store, a small church, and a saloon. But to Jacob, who saw other people only once a month, it might as well have been a big city. He tied Thunder to the hitching post outside Morrison's general store and pushed through the heavy wooden door. The bell above the door jingled, and old Henry Morrison looked up from behind the counter. "Well, well, if it isn't our mountain man," Henry said with a friendly smile. "How are things up there in the clouds, Jacob?" "Can't complain," Jacob replied, pulling out his supply list. "Need the usual: flour, beans, coffee, some ammunition, and whatever vegetables you've got that won't spoil on the ride back." As Henry gathered the supplies, Jacob noticed a small crowd had formed near the back of the store. Several townspeople were talking in hushed voices, and their faces looked worried. Jacob wasn't usually one to pry into other people's business, but something about their serious expressions caught his attention. "What's all the fuss about?" Jacob asked Henry as he counted out coins for his purchases. Henry glanced toward the group and lowered his voice. "Oh, it's about that poor girl. The mail-order bride who came in on last week's train. Real sad situation, if you ask me." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Mail-order bride? Haven't heard about any bride coming to town." "Well, that's because nobody's claimed her yet," Henry explained, shaking his head. "See, she came here to marry Tom Bradley, but when she got off that train, she had this burlap sack over her head. Wouldn't take it off, not even for the wedding ceremony. Tom got spooked and called the whole thing off." This was certainly unusual news. Cedar Falls didn't get many visitors, and a mail-order bride was already big news. But one with a sack over her head? That was something Jacob had never heard of before. "A sack over her head?" Jacob asked, trying to picture such a strange sight. "Why would she do that?" "Nobody knows for sure," Henry continued, warming up to the story. "Some folks think she must have some terrible disfigurement, maybe burns from a fire or scars from an accident. Others think she might be hiding from someone dangerous. All we know is that she won't show her face to anyone." Jacob listened carefully as Henry continued the tale. After Tom Bradley rejected her, the young woman had been passed along to 2 other men who had previously expressed interest in finding wives. But both of them had also refused to marry someone whose face they couldn't see. The poor woman had been staying at the boarding house for over a week now, and everyone in town was talking about what to do with her. "Pastor Williams has been trying to help," Henry said, wrapping Jacob's supplies in brown paper. "But the railroad company is getting impatient. They say if nobody claims her by the end of this week, they'll put her on the next train back east. The company doesn't want to keep paying for her room and board." Jacob felt a strange stirring in his chest, a mixture of curiosity and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Where is she now?" "Still at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, I believe. Pastor Williams has been bringing her meals and trying to convince her to at least talk to people, but she barely says a word. Just sits in her room most of the time." As Jacob loaded his supplies into his saddlebags, he couldn't stop thinking about this mysterious woman. What could have happened to her that made her so afraid to show her face? And what would happen to her if she was sent back east? Surely someone who had traveled so far to find a new life must be running from something terrible. The conversation in the back of the store was getting louder, and Jacob could now make out some of the words. Mrs. Henderson, the town's biggest gossip. was saying something about bad luck and probably cursed. Her husband was nodding along, adding that no good can come from marrying someone who won't show her face. But Pastor Williams, a kind man in his 60s, was defending the unknown woman. "We don't know her story," he was saying firmly. "She could be a perfectly decent person who's just been through something difficult. It's not Christian to turn our backs on someone in need." "Easy for you to say, Pastor," replied Joe Murphy, who owned the saloon. "You're not the one being asked to marry her. Would you want your son to marry a woman he'd never seen?" "That's different," Pastor Williams said. "Marriage is a serious commitment, but that doesn't mean we should abandon her completely. There must be someone willing to give her a chance." Jacob found himself walking toward the group before he even realized what he was doing. The conversation stopped when they noticed him approaching, and several people looked uncomfortable. Jacob wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't exactly known for being social either. "Excuse me, Pastor Williams," Jacob said quietly. "I couldn't help but overhear about the young lady's situation. Is it true that she'll be sent away if nobody marries her?" Pastor Williams nodded sadly. "I'm afraid so, Jacob. The railroad company has been more than patient, but they can't support her indefinitely. She needs someone to claim responsibility for her, and in this town that means marriage." "What do you know about her?" Jacob asked. "I mean, besides the obvious." "Not much, I'm sorry to say," the pastor admitted. "Her name is Eleanor Reed, and she came from somewhere back east. Boston, I think. She has a sweet voice and seems educated. She's always polite when I bring her meals, but she won't talk about her past or why she covers her face." Mrs. Henderson sniffed disapprovingly. "Mark my words, she's hiding something terrible. Decent women don't go around with sacks over their heads. There's something wrong with her, and whoever marries her will regret it." Jacob felt a flash of anger at the woman's harsh words. "Maybe she's just scared," he said firmly. "Did anyone think of that? Maybe she's been hurt and doesn't trust people anymore." The group fell silent at Jacob's unexpected defense of someone he'd never even met. They all knew Jacob as a quiet, solitary man who rarely expressed opinions about anything that didn't directly concern him. Pastor Williams looked at Jacob with new interest. "That's a very compassionate way to look at it, Jacob. I wish more people in town shared your perspective." Jacob shifted uncomfortably under the attention. "I just think everyone deserves a chance," he said simply. "And nobody should be thrown away just because they're different." As he spoke these words, Jacob realized he was thinking about his own situation. How many times had he felt rejected or misunderstood because he chose to live alone on the mountain? How many times had people in town whispered about him being strange or antisocial? Maybe he and this mysterious Eleanor had more in common than anyone realized. "Pastor Williams," Jacob said suddenly, surprising himself with his boldness, "what would it take for someone to marry her? I mean, legally speaking?" The pastor's eyebrows shot up. "Well, it would be a simple ceremony, just like any other wedding." "Why do you ask?" Jacob took a deep breath. He could feel everyone staring at him and his heart was beating fast. But something inside him had made a decision before his brain could catch up. "Because I'll marry her." The silence that followed was so complete that Jacob could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind the counter. Mrs. Henderson's mouth fell open. Joe Murphy dropped the coin he'd been flipping. Even Henry Morrison stopped sorting through his inventory to stare. "Jacob," Pastor Williams said carefully, "are you certain about this? Marriage is a sacred commitment and you've never even met the young lady." "I'm certain," Jacob replied, though his voice was shakier than he would have liked. "If she needs someone to marry her to stay safe, then I'll do it. I live alone anyway, and my cabin is big enough for 2 people. Mrs. Henderson found her voice first. "Jacob Thornton, have you lost your mind? You can't marry someone whose face you've never seen. What if she's hideous? What if she's dangerous? What if she's not?" Jacob shot back. "What if she's just a person who needs help?" Pastor Williams stepped closer to Jacob. "Son, I admire your generous heart, but this is a big decision. Are you prepared for the responsibilities of marriage? Are you ready to care for someone else?" Jacob thought about his lonely cabin and the empty chair by his fireplace. He thought about the silent dinners and The next morning came faster than Jacob expected. He had barely slept, tossing and turning as he wondered what Pastor Williams would tell him about Eleanor's response to his proposal. Would she agree to marry a stranger? Would she think he was crazy for offering? Jacob was up before dawn, cleaning his cabin with more energy than he'd put into housework in years. He swept the floors, washed the windows, and even picked wildflowers to put in a jar on the small wooden table where he ate his meals. He wanted everything to be perfect just in case. Around mid-morning, he heard the sound of a horse approaching. Jacob's heart started beating faster as he recognized Pastor Williams riding up the mountain trail. Behind him, on a gentle mare, rode a figure completely covered in a long brown dress and that infamous burlap sack over her head. Jacob stepped out onto his porch, wiping his suddenly sweaty palms on his pants. This was really happening. The mysterious Eleanor Reed was here, and in just a few minutes she might become his wife. Pastor Williams dismounted and helped Eleanor down from her horse. Even through the bulky sack and loose-fitting dress, Jacob could tell she was trembling. Her hand shook as she gripped the pastor's arm for support. "Good morning, Jacob," Pastor Williams said warmly. "I'd like you to meet Miss Eleanor Reed. Eleanor, this is Jacob Thornton, the man I told you about." Eleanor gave a small curtsy but didn't speak. Jacob could hear her breathing quickly like she was scared or nervous. He felt bad that his proposal had probably added to whatever fear she was already carrying. "Miss Reed," Jacob said gently, "I'm honored to meet you. I hope Pastor Williams explained that I don't expect anything from you except companionship. This marriage would be to help you, not to take advantage of you." Eleanor's head tilted slightly toward him, and he heard her whisper, "Thank you, Mr. Thornton. Pastor Williams says you're a kind man." Her voice was soft and sweet, with a slight accent that suggested education and refinement. Whatever Eleanor was hiding under that sack, she certainly didn't sound like the dangerous or crazy person some townspeople had imagined. "Shall we proceed with the ceremony?" Pastor Williams asked. "Eleanor has agreed to the marriage, and I have all the necessary papers." Jacob nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, let's do this." The wedding ceremony was unlike anything Jacob had ever imagined. They stood in front of his cabin with the beautiful mountain scenery all around them, but the bride's face remained completely hidden. Pastor Williams read from his prayer book while Eleanor's hands shook so hard she could barely hold the simple wildflower bouquet Jacob had quickly picked for her. "Do you, Jacob Thornton, take Eleanor Reed to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Jacob said firmly, meaning every word even though he knew almost nothing about the woman beside him. "And do you, Eleanor Reed, take Jacob Thornton to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me I pronounce you husband and wife," Pastor Williams announced. "Jacob, you may kiss your bride." This was the moment Jacob had been dreading. How could he kiss someone whose face he couldn't see? But Eleanor solved the problem by quickly stepping back and shaking her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can't, not yet." "That's perfectly fine," Jacob said quickly. "We have plenty of time to get to know each other." Pastor Williams completed the paperwork and wished them both well. Before leaving, he pulled Jacob aside. "Be patient with her," he advised quietly. "I think she's been hurt badly by someone, though she won't say who or how. She's going to need time to trust you." After the pastor left, Jacob and Eleanor stood awkwardly in front of the cabin. The sun was getting higher, and Jacob could see sweat stains appearing on Eleanor's dress where the heavy burlap sack trapped heat around her head and shoulders. "Would you like to come inside?" Jacob asked. "It's cooler in the cabin and you must be uncomfortable in that covering." Eleanor nodded gratefully and followed him through the door. Jacob was proud of how clean and welcoming he'd made the cabin look. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making the simple furniture and colorful quilt on the bed look warm and homey. "This is lovely," Eleanor said softly, her first unsolicited comment since arriving. "It feels peaceful here." "Thank you," Jacob replied. "I built most of it myself over the years. The bedroom is there." He pointed to a corner where he'd hung a curtain for privacy. "That's yours now. I'll sleep out here by the fireplace." Eleanor turned toward him, and even though he couldn't see her face, Jacob sensed surprise in her posture. "You don't expect me to? That is, we won't be sharing." "No," Jacob said quickly, understanding her concern. "This marriage is for your protection, remember? I won't ask anything of you that you're not ready to give." Eleanor's shoulders seemed to relax a little. "You really are kind, aren't you, Mr. Thornton?" "Just Jacob, please. And I try to be decent, that's all." They spent the afternoon getting Eleanor settled in. Jacob showed her where he kept food, how to work the wood stove, and where to find fresh water from the spring behind the cabin. Eleanor listened carefully to everything but kept her distance and, of course, never removed the sack. As evening approached, Jacob prepared a simple dinner of venison stew and fresh bread. Eleanor offered to help, but her movements were clumsy and uncertain with the sack limiting her vision. She bumped into the table twice and nearly knocked over a lamp. "Eleanor," Jacob said gently, "wouldn't you be more comfortable if you took that covering off, at least while you're eating?" Eleanor froze completely. "I can't," she whispered. "Please don't ask me to." "I'm sorry," Jacob said quickly. "I didn't mean to upset you. It's just that it seems difficult for you to see properly and you must be hot and uncomfortable." "I am uncomfortable," Eleanor admitted, "but not as uncomfortable as I would be without it." Jacob watched as Eleanor tried to eat her stew through a small opening she created by lifting the bottom edge of the sack slightly. Most of the food ended up on her dress or the floor. It was clear this wasn't working, but Jacob didn't know how to help without making her more upset. After dinner, they sat by the fireplace as darkness fell outside. The silence was becoming awkward, and Jacob struggled to think of something to say that wouldn't sound foolish or intrusive. "Eleanor," he finally said, "I know this is strange for both of us. I don't know what brought you here or why you feel you need to hide yourself, but I want you to know that whatever it is, you're safe here. I would never hurt you or force you to do anything you don't want to do." Eleanor was quiet for so long that Jacob wondered if she'd fallen asleep. Then she spoke so softly he had to lean forward to hear her. "What if what I'm hiding would make you sorry you married me?" she asked. "What if you saw me and regretted your kindness?" Jacob thought carefully before answering. "Eleanor, I've been alone on this mountain for 8 years. Before that I was alone in town, and before that I was alone in my family's house. I've never had anyone who cared whether I came home safe or whether I had enough to eat. Just having someone here who talks to me is more than I dared hope for. Whatever you think is wrong with you, it couldn't be worse than the loneliness I've been living with." Eleanor turned toward him, and Jacob could sense she was studying his face even though he couldn't see hers. "You really mean that, don't you?" "I do," Jacob said simply. Eleanor was quiet again for several minutes. Then slowly she reached up and began to untie the rope that held the burlap sack in place. Jacob's heart started pounding, but he forced himself to sit still and not stare too eagerly. "Please don't be afraid of me," Eleanor whispered as she began to lift the sack. "I won't be," Jacob promised, though he had no idea what he was about to see. Eleanor pulled the burlap sack up and over her head, and Jacob's mouth fell open in shock. But not for the reason either of them expected. The woman sitting across from him was absolutely beautiful. Her hair was a rich auburn color that caught the firelight and seemed to glow. Her skin was pale and smooth, with just a light dusting of freckles across her nose. Her eyes were the most incredible shade of green Jacob had ever seen, like the forest in springtime. Her features were delicate but strong, with high cheekbones and a perfectly shaped mouth. Jacob stared in complete amazement. This was what Eleanor had been hiding? This breathtaking beauty that would have made every man in Cedar Falls fight for the chance to marry her? But as Jacob continued to stare, Eleanor's expression changed from nervous hope to crushing disappointment. She saw the shock on his face and misunderstood it completely. "I knew it," she whispered, tears starting to stream down her cheeks. "I knew you'd be horrified." "What?" Jacob asked, confused. "Horrified? Eleanor, you're—" But Eleanor was already reaching for the burlap sack, trying to pull it back over her head. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I should have warned you better. Pastor William said you seemed like a good man who wouldn't care about appearances, but I can see the disgust in your eyes." "Disgust?" Jacob jumped up from his chair and moved toward her, but Eleanor shrank away from him. "Eleanor, no! You don't understand. I'm not disgusted. I'm amazed." Eleanor paused in her struggle to replace the sack. Amazed? The first week of marriage passed quietly for Jacob and Eleanor. Each morning, Jacob would wake early to tend to his traps and check on his small garden behind the cabin. Eleanor would already be awake, quietly preparing breakfast and tidying the cabin. They moved around each other carefully like two strangers sharing space, which in many ways they were. Eleanor no longer wore the burlap sack, but Jacob noticed she still found ways to hide herself. She would turn away when he looked at her directly, keep her hair hanging loose to partially cover her face, and wear dresses that seemed too big for her slender frame. It was as if burning the sack had been symbolic, but the real work of healing was still ahead of them. Jacob tried to be patient and give Eleanor space to adjust to her new life. He could see that she was making an effort. She cooked meals, mended his torn shirts, and even helped him organize his tools in the small workshop attached to the cabin. But conversations between them were still awkward and formal, like they were both afraid of saying the wrong thing. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace after dinner, Jacob decided to try a different approach. Instead of asking Eleanor about her past, he started talking about his own. "I wasn't always a mountain man," he said, poking at the logs with an iron rod. "I grew up in Cedar Falls, actually. My father owned the sawmill there." Eleanor looked up from the sewing she'd been working on. "Really? I hadn't realized you were from the town." "Born and raised there," Jacob continued. "Had a younger brother named Tommy who was everyone's favorite. He was charming and funny, always knew the right thing to say. I was the quiet one, the serious one. People used to say Tommy got all the personality and I got all the stubbornness." Eleanor set down her sewing completely, sensing that Jacob was sharing something important. "What happened to Tommy?" Jacob's expression grew sad.
"He died when he was 22.
"There was an accident at the mill. A log broke loose from the chain and crushed him. It happened so fast there was nothing anyone could do." "I'm so sorry," Eleanor said softly. "That must have been terrible for you and your family." "It was," Jacob admitted. "But the worst part came after. My parents were so destroyed by losing Tommy that they could barely look at me anymore. Every time they saw me, I think they were reminded that the wrong son had survived. My father started drinking heavily and my mother just disappeared inside herself." Eleanor moved closer to Jacob's chair, drawn by the pain in his voice. "Surely they didn't blame you for the accident." "Not directly," Jacob said. "But I could feel their disappointment every day. Tommy had been planning to take over the mill, to carry on the family business. He was supposed to get married to the banker's daughter and give them grandchildren. I was just there, the leftover son." Eleanor reached out hesitantly and touched Jacob's hand. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact since their wedding day. "That's not true. You have value beyond what you can do for other people." Jacob looked down at her small hand covering his larger one. Her skin was soft and warm, and he felt comforted by the simple touch. "I started spending more and more time up here in the mountains hunting and trapping. It was peaceful, and I didn't have to see the disappointment in anyone's eyes. Eventually, I just stayed, built this cabin and made a life for myself away from all the expectations and comparisons." "Do you ever miss it?" Eleanor asked.
Living around other people?
"Sometimes," Jacob admitted. "Especially during the long winters when the snow is so deep I can't get to town for months at a time. But I got used to the solitude. Until now, I thought it was what I preferred." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, processing what Jacob had shared. "Thank you for telling me that," she finally said. "It helps to know that you understand what it's like to feel unwanted." "Is that how you felt in Boston?" Jacob asked gently. "Unwanted?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "For so long I thought I had everything a woman could want. A beautiful home, fine clothes, a handsome fiancé from a good family. I thought I was living the perfect life." She paused, staring into the fire. Richard Blackwood was considered quite a catch. He was tall and sophisticated, with perfect manners and an excellent education. Every unmarried woman in Boston society envied me when our engagement was announced. Jacob felt a stab of jealousy at the obvious admiration in Eleanor's voice, even though she was talking about a man who had deeply hurt her. "He was charming and confident," Eleanor continued. "He knew exactly what to say to make people like him. I felt so fortunate that he had chosen me out of all the available young ladies." "But he wasn't who he seemed to be," Jacob observed. "No, he wasn't," Eleanor agreed sadly. "At first, everything seemed wonderful. He would bring me flowers and take me to fancy parties. He told me I was beautiful and that he couldn't wait to make me his wife. I thought I was the luckiest woman alive." Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark mountain landscape. "But as our wedding day approached, Richard started to change. He became critical of little things, the way I laughed, the books I enjoyed reading, my opinions about social issues. He said I needed to become more sophisticated if I was going to be his wife." Jacob felt his anger building again. "He was trying to control you." I didn't see it that way at the time, Eleanor admitted. I thought he was helping me improve myself. I started changing everything about myself to please him. I stopped reading books he didn't approve of, stopped expressing opinions that differed from his, even stopped laughing as much because he said my laugh was too loud for proper society. That must have been exhausting, Jacob said, thinking about how terrible it would be to constantly monitor and change yourself for someone else's approval. It was, Eleanor agreed, turning back to face him. But I thought that's what love was supposed to be like. I thought if I just tried hard enough to become the woman Richard wanted, we would be happy together. Eleanor returned to her chair and picked up her sewing again, but her hands were shaking too much to make neat stitches. 3 days before our wedding, I went to his family's house to discuss some final details about the ceremony. The butler said Richard was in the library, so I went to find him. She set down the sewing again, unable to concentrate on it while reliving such painful memories. The library door was slightly open and I heard voices inside. I was about to knock when I heard my sister's laugh. Jacob waited patiently for Eleanor to continue, sensing that this was the heart of her pain. I pushed the door open and found them together, Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard and Catherine, my younger sister. They were embracing, in a way that left no doubt about what had been happening between them. "What did you do?" Jacob asked. "I stood there like a fool, too shocked to move or speak," Eleanor said. "They saw me and jumped apart, but neither of them looked ashamed or sorry. If anything, they looked annoyed that I had interrupted them." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists in her lap. Richard actually had the nerve to act like I was overreacting. He said what I had seen didn't mean anything, that it was just a moment of weakness before he settled down into married life. "And your sister?" Catherine laughed, Eleanor said bitterly. She actually laughed and said I should be grateful that Richard was getting his wild impulses out of his system before the wedding. She said most men needed that kind of excitement and I should be understanding about it. Jacob shook his head in disgust. That's not normal or acceptable behavior from either of them. But then they started saying things that cut much deeper, Eleanor continued. Richard said the reason he had turned to Catherine was because I was so cold and boring. He said I had no passion, no fire, that being with me was like being with a statue. Catherine agreed. She said any man would need to find excitement elsewhere when faced with the prospect of being married to someone as dull as me. Jacob wanted to interrupt and tell Eleanor how wrong they had been, but he could see she needed to get the whole story out. The worst part was when Richard said he was only marrying me for my father's money and business connections. He said I should be grateful that any man was willing to take on such an undesirable wife, especially one who would probably never be able to satisfy a husband's needs. Eleanor began crying softly. I ran out of the house and went straight home to tell my parents what had happened. I thought surely they would be as shocked and angry as I was, but they weren't. My father was furious, but not at Richard or Catherine, Eleanor said through her tears. He was angry at me for causing a scandal. He said I must have done something to drive Richard away, that I had failed as a fiancé and brought shame on our family. Jacob felt sick thinking about how abandoned Eleanor must have felt.
What about your mother?
Mother was devastated about the broken engagement and the social embarrassment. She kept asking what she had done wrong in raising me, why I couldn't hold on to a good man like Richard. She said maybe if I had been prettier or more charming, Richard wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere for companionship. That's cruel and unfair, Jacob said firmly. None of what happened was your fault. Eleanor looked at him with surprise. How can you say that? You didn't know me then. Maybe I really was as cold and boring as they said. Maybe Richard was right to look for affection elsewhere. 3 weeks into their marriage, Jacob and Eleanor had settled into a comfortable routine. Each morning, Eleanor would wake to find that Jacob had already started the coffee and brought in fresh eggs from the small chicken coop he maintained behind the cabin. She would prepare breakfast while he tended to his traps and checked the small vegetable garden that was beginning to flourish under her careful attention. Eleanor was changing in ways that surprised both of them. Without the constant criticism and pressure she had lived with in Boston, her natural personality was beginning to emerge. She hummed while she worked, asked Jacob questions about mountain life, and even laughed at his occasionally awkward attempts at humor. The fearful hidden woman who had arrived in a burlap sack was gradually being replaced by someone more confident and at peace. One morning, Jacob came in from his rounds to find Eleanor kneading bread dough with flour streaked across her cheeks and a look of concentration on her face. Her auburn hair was pinned back loosely, with several strands escaping to frame her face. She looked so beautiful and so perfectly at home in their kitchen that Jacob stopped in the doorway just to watch her. "The bread is fighting back today," Eleanor said with a laugh, noticing Jacob's stare. "I think I may have added too much flour." "Here, let me help," Jacob offered, moving to stand beside her at the wooden counter. "My mother used to make bread every week. I might remember a few tricks." As they worked together, their hands occasionally brushed while shaping the dough. Each touch sent little sparks of awareness through both of them, though neither mentioned it aloud. They were growing closer every day, but both were careful not to push too fast or assume too much. "Jacob," Eleanor said as they waited for the bread to rise, "would it be all right if I planted some flowers around the cabin? I found some wildflower seeds in town last week, and I thought they might make the place look more cheerful." "Of course," Jacob replied, pleased that Eleanor was thinking of the cabin as her home now. "Plant whatever makes you happy. This is your place too, Eleanor." Eleanor smiled and impulsively stood on her tiptoes to kiss Jacob's cheek. It was a quick, innocent kiss, but it was the first time she had initiated any physical affection. Both of them froze for a moment, surprised by the gesture. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said quickly, stepping back. "I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," Jacob said gently, touching the spot where her lips had brushed his skin. "That was nice. I liked it." Eleanor blushed prettily but didn't look away. "I'm starting to feel safe here," she said softly. "With you. I haven't felt safe in so long that I'd almost forgotten what it was like." Jacob felt his heart swell with tenderness for this brave woman who was slowly learning to trust again. "I'm glad," he said simply. "You should always feel safe in your own home." Their peaceful morning was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Jacob frowned, looking out the window to see two men on horseback making their way up the mountain trail. Visitors were rare enough that they usually meant either very good news or very bad news. "Are you expecting anyone?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with sudden anxiety. "No," Jacob replied, his own instincts telling him something wasn't right. "Eleanor, why don't you go into the bedroom while I see what they want?" Eleanor nodded and quickly disappeared behind the curtain that divided their sleeping area from the main room. Jacob checked to make sure his rifle was within easy reach before opening the door to greet their unexpected visitors. The first man to dismount was someone Jacob didn't recognize, a tall, well-dressed stranger with expensive clothes and an air of authority. The second man was Sheriff Morrison from Cedar Falls, and his presence immediately put Jacob on alert. "Mr. Thornton," Sheriff Morrison said with obvious reluctance. "This is Mr. Richard Blackwood from Boston. He's looking for a woman who may be your wife." Jacob felt his blood turn to ice. This was Eleanor's former fiancé, the man who had betrayed and humiliated her so badly that she had fled across the country to escape. Jacob looked at Richard Blackwood with barely concealed disgust, taking in the man's perfect appearance and arrogant expression. Richard was indeed handsome in the way Eleanor had described, tall and sophisticated, with dark hair slicked back and expensive clothes that probably cost more than Jacob made in a year. But there was something cold about his eyes, something calculating and cruel that set Jacob's teeth on edge. "I'm looking for Miss Eleanor Reed," Richard said in a smooth, educated voice that carried just a hint of condescension. "I have reason to believe she may have entered into a hasty marriage arrangement that she now regrets." "My wife's name is Eleanor Thornton," Jacob replied evenly, "and I can assure you she's exactly where she wants to be." Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Thornton, I don't think you understand the situation. Eleanor is from a refined Boston family. She's educated and cultured, accustomed to the finer things in life. Surely you can see that she doesn't belong in this rustic environment." Jacob felt his temper rising but forced himself to stay calm. "What my wife belongs is for her to decide, not you." "Your wife?" Richard laughed unpleasantly. "Mr. Thornton, Eleanor Reed is my fiancée. We've been engaged for over a year. Whatever ceremony you may have gone through with her was based on false pretenses." Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. "Mr. Blackwood says he has documents proving his engagement to the woman," he said apologetically to Jacob. "He's asked me to ensure her safety and verify that she entered this marriage of her own free will." Of course she did," Jacob said firmly. "Pastor Williams performed the ceremony himself. You can ask him." I have asked him, Richard interjected smoothly, and he confirmed that the woman in question kept her face covered throughout the entire proceedings. How can anyone be certain of her identity or her state of mind under such unusual circumstances? Jacob realized that Richard was cleverly casting doubt on the legitimacy of their marriage, while positioning himself as a concerned fiancé, trying to rescue his beloved. The man was clearly skilled at manipulation and probably very convincing to people who didn't know the truth about what he had done. Perhaps we could speak with Mrs. Thornton directly? Sheriff Morrison suggested. If she confirms that she married you willingly and wants to stay, then Mr. Blackwood will have to accept that and return to Boston. Jacob knew he couldn't refuse this request without making it look like he was holding Eleanor against her will, but he was terrified about how she would react to seeing Richard again. Would the sight of her former fiancé bring back all her old fears and self-doubts? Eleanor, Jacob called toward the bedroom. Could you come out here, please? There are some people who want to speak with you. Eleanor appeared from behind the curtain and Jacob watched her face carefully as she took in the scene. When her eyes fell on Richard, she went completely pale and grabbed the doorframe for support. Hello? Eleanor, Richard said in the same smooth voice. Though Jacob noticed his eyes widen slightly when he saw how beautiful Eleanor looked without her covering. I've come a very long way to find you. What are you doing here? Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. Richard stepped forward with what was probably meant to be a charming smile. I've come to take you home, darling. I've realized what a terrible mistake I made, and I want to make things right between us. Eleanor shook her head slowly, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Make things right? Richard, with Catherine. I said many foolish things when I was young and stupid, Richard interrupted smoothly. But I've had time to think, and I realize now how much I love you, how much I need you. Please, Eleanor, give me a chance to explain everything. Jacob watched this exchange with growing anger and concern. He could see that Eleanor was struggling with a mixture of old feelings and new confusion. Part of her was probably remembering the hopes and dreams she had once attached to this man, while another part was remembering the pain he had caused her. Eleanor, Sheriff Morrison said gently, I need to ask you directly. Did you marry Mr. Thornton of your own free will? Are you here because you want to be, or do you need help leaving? Eleanor looked back and forth between Richard and Jacob, clearly torn. Jacob forced himself to remain quiet, knowing that anything he said might be seen as pressure or coercion. This had to be Eleanor's choice, even if it broke his heart. I married Jacob willingly, Eleanor said finally, her voice growing stronger. No one forced me to do anything. But surely you can see this isn't the life you were meant for, Richard said persuasively. Eleanor, you're living in a tiny cabin on a mountain, doing manual labor cut off from culture and society. In Boston, you could have everything you deserve. A beautiful home, fine clothes, social connections. I can give you the life you were born to live. Jacob saw doubt creeping into Eleanor's expression and felt his heart sink. He realized that Richard was appealing to everything Eleanor had been taught to value from childhood: wealth, status, and social acceptance. Even though she had been happier in the past few weeks than she had been in years, old conditioning was hard to overcome. What about Catherine? Eleanor asked quietly. What about what you said about me being cold and boring? Richard's mask slipped slightly, but he recovered quickly. Eleanor barely slept that night. She lay in her small bed behind the curtain, listening to Jacob's steady breathing from his place by the fireplace, and tried to sort through the chaos of emotions that Richard's sudden appearance had stirred up. Part of her was terrified by the choice she had to make, while another part was angry that she had to make it at all. By morning, she had reached a decision. She would go to town and speak with Richard privately, away from Jacob's protective presence. She needed to face her past honestly before she could choose her future. If she was going to stay with Jacob, and her heart was pulling her strongly in that direction, she wanted to do it with complete certainty, not because she was afraid to confront difficult truths. I need to go to Cedar Falls today, Eleanor announced as she and Jacob shared breakfast. I want to talk to Richard alone to hear what he really has to say. Jacob's face went pale, but he nodded. I understand. Do you want me to come with you? No, Eleanor said gently. I need to do this by myself. I need to know that whatever decision I make, it's truly my own choice. Jacob was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with his desire to protect Eleanor and his respect for her independence. When will you be back? This evening, Eleanor promised. Jacob, I want you to know that no matter what Richard says, these past few weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. That's not going to change, regardless of what happens today. Jacob reached across the table and took her hand. I love you, Eleanor. Not the idea of you, not what you can do for me, but you. Exactly as you are right now. Whatever you decide today, that won't change either. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. I love you too, she said softly. That's why I need to be completely sure about my choice. You deserve someone who chooses you with her whole heart, not someone who's running away from something else. The ride to Cedar Falls gave Eleanor time to think about everything that had happened since she arrived in Colorado territory. She thought about the frightened woman who had stepped off the train with a burlap sack over her head, convinced she was unworthy of love. Then she thought about the woman she had become over the past few weeks, confident enough to plant flowers, comfortable enough to laugh at Jacob's jokes, brave enough to kiss his cheek without overthinking it. Which version of herself was real? The broken woman Richard and her family had created, or the healing woman Jacob had helped her discover? She found Richard waiting for her at the boarding house, looking every bit as handsome and polished as he had the day before. He smiled when he saw her, the same charming smile that had once made her heart flutter. Eleanor, darling, I'm so glad you came, he said, standing to greet her. Shall we take a walk? I'd prefer to speak privately. They walked to the edge of town where a small creek ran through a grove of cottonwood trees. It was a peaceful spot, and Eleanor could see why Richard had chosen it for their conversation. But instead of feeling romantic or special, she found herself comparing it unfavorably to the view from Jacob's cabin, where mountains stretched endlessly toward the sky. Eleanor, I owe you an apology, Richard began once they were seated on a fallen log beside the water. I behaved badly in Boston, and I've regretted it every day since you left. Have you? Eleanor asked quietly. Or do you regret the social embarrassment it caused? Richard looked surprised by her directness. The Eleanor he remembered had been much more passive, more willing to accept whatever he told her. I regret hurting you, he said carefully. You didn't deserve what happened. No, I didn't, Eleanor agreed. But I want to understand something, Richard. When you were with Catherine, when you said those cruel things about me being cold and boring, did you mean them? Richard hesitated just a moment too long before answering. I was angry and confused. Young men sometimes make mistakes when they're feeling pressured about commitment. Eleanor noticed that he hadn't actually answered her question. That's not what I asked. Did you mean what you said about me? Richard shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor, you have to understand. The expectations placed on men of my social position are enormous. We're expected to marry well, to choose wives who will enhance our standing in society. Sometimes the pressure to do the right thing can make a man feel trapped. Eleanor felt a cold clarity settling over her. So you did mean it. You did think I was boring and inadequate. Not inadequate, Richard said quickly. Just not exciting. Not the kind of woman who inspires passion. But Eleanor, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Passionate women can be difficult to manage. A calm, steady wife is actually an asset for a man in my position. Eleanor stared at him in amazement. An asset? Is that how you see marriage? As a business arrangement where I'm supposed to be a useful piece of property? Richard looked confused by her reaction. Eleanor, you're speaking as if that's a bad thing. Your father and I have worked out an excellent arrangement. Your family's shipping connections combined with my family's banking interests could create a very profitable partnership, and you would have everything you could possibly want, a beautiful home, fine clothes, social prominence. What about love? Eleanor asked. What about companionship and respect and genuine affection? Richard waved his hand dismissively. Those things are nice, but they're not practical foundations for marriage. Eleanor, you've been living in this wilderness for barely a month, and it's clearly affected your thinking. You've forgotten what real life is like. Eleanor stood up and began pacing beside the creek. No, Richard. I think I'm remembering what real life should be like. Tell me something. Do you even like me? Not what I represent or what my family can provide, but me as a person? Richard looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Of course I like you. You're well-bred, attractive, and you know how to behave properly in social situations. What more is there to like? What are my interests? Eleanor asked suddenly. What books do I enjoy reading? What makes me laugh? What are my dreams and fears? Richard opened and closed his mouth several times. clearly unable to answer any of her questions. After a moment, he seemed to realize this wasn't the reaction Eleanor was looking for. "Eleanor, you're being unreasonable," he said, his voice taking on a slight edge. "We've been apart for weeks. Of course, I don't remember every little detail about your preferences, but that doesn't mean I don't care about you." "I think it means exactly that," Eleanor said quietly. "Richard, in the past month, Jacob has learned that I hum while I work, that I'm afraid of thunderstorms, that I like to read poetry, and that I worry about whether I'm useful enough to deserve the space I take up in the world. He knows these things because he pays attention to me, because he's interested in who I really am." Richard's expression was growing colder by the minute. "This mountain man has obviously filled your head with romantic nonsense. Eleanor, he's using you. Men like that see a refined woman like yourself as a prize to be won. Once the novelty wears off, he'll grow tired of you just like you did." Eleanor finished for him. Richard had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "That's not what I meant, but it's what happened, isn't it?" Eleanor pressed. "You grew tired of me before we were even married. That's why you turned to Catherine. And now you want me back not because you love me, but because your reputation suffered when our engagement ended." Richard's mask of charm was beginning to slip completely. "Eleanor, you're being very difficult. I've come all this way to offer you a second chance to restore your position in society.